So, welcome to the debut of season 2 of the Reboot Biblical Perspective educational podcast. I am your host, Zane Pierre, and in this episode, what we're going to do is give you a brief intro as to what season 2 is going to be centered around. And we're going to start taking a look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. 5 things that you should know when you're approaching the God narrative.
Welcome to the legendary Reboot, your biblical perspective educational podcast, where ancient divine wisdom meets contemporary revelation. This groundbreaking and illuminating series called Ancient Garden Narratives is not just a rehash of familiar Bible stories, but a journey into the core ancient principles that form the foundation of interpreting the sacred scriptures. Whether you are a seasoned scholar or a curious seeker, as we peel back the layers of interpretations influenced by Constantine's Gentile perspectives and juxtapose them against the divine ancient priestly perspectives, the revelations as profound as the ancient seas and as enduring as the celestial firmament shall resonate through the corridors of your existence, altering the very fabric of your being for all eternity. Let's welcome your divine priestly guide, Zane Pierre, as he stewards you in the mind of Christ in spiritual exploration that shall illuminate the path to the sacred truths that lie dormant within the annals of time.
Boom! And we are back in the house again. Zane El Fuego on the mic. This is season 2 of the Reboot Your Biblical Perspective educational podcast that is specific to our spiritual goal members on our Patreon platform. We have actually stopped at well over 400 episodes in the previous season. We are actually not abandoning the completion of the Gospel of John, but simply put it on pause before I continue into the Gospel of John. This season is actually going to be dedicated to diving into Bible stories. All right, for those of you who are already on Patreon, you would have been following the Reboot Biblical Perspective educational podcast season 1, and in season 1, what we were doing is pretty much applying parodies to the Gospel of John with a priority on the principle of God's name as the cognitive law that you approach the scriptures through, as well as using the God narrative as the priority through which it is interpreted. But it was centered around using parodies, the 4 levels of interpretation in the Gospel of John. We had reached John in chapter 15 or 16, and we are going to continue, and we will let all Patreon members know when that will be. We are going to continue and complete John. We'll let you know when that will be. All right. For now, this podcast, season 2, was carded since last month. And so we are getting started within the middle of March. And I am pleased to say that I am delighted to really get started with season 2, in particular, the season that we have promised for so long. All right. Now, in this season of the podcast, we're diving into Bible stories. Right? The twist is we're actually going to be looking at one Bible story at a time as we go along this podcast. Not necessarily one Bible story per episode, but one Bible story at a time. And in each episode, what we're going to do is do something that you have never heard before. We're going to look at Bible stories from the perspective, or from 2 very different perspectives, or 2 very different angles. Firstly, to help you renew your mind according to the God narrative and the name of God as the primary law of the scriptures, we are going to explore the stories through the lens that you have learned it, which is what we call at the International Institute of Pneumatology, or the Anointed Life Mentorship International, the Constantinian perspectives of that story. Which basically means that if we start the God narrative, we're going to just take a look at briefly at some of the things that you may have been taught concerning the God narrative, so that you can be able to identify what you were taught exactly and the lens that you were taught it through. And then we're going to put that into perspective as Gentile interpretation of the scriptures from Constantine the Great, also known as Emperor Constantine. And then we are going to contrast them with what we call the circumcised perspectives of the scriptures, which is from the perspective of the name of God as the cognitive law that you read the scriptures through, which is a very, very different perspective to begin with. And we are going to be using parodies, which is the 4 levels of interpretation of the text, as we take a look at each Bible story and unpack valuable gems, valuable insights into these narratives that may have been looking at you for all of these years and you have never been able to identify it. Right? So we're going to take a look at it through the name and the garden. Right? Paradies means garden. The gardening with the name and the garden interpretation of the text. Right? Now we've actually made a differentiation between the Constantinian perspectives and the name and the garden perspective, or the circumcised perspective, because as you may have known, if you have not actually looked into history, you will know that the scriptures, formerly known as the Tanakh, in reference to the Old Testament, I would explain what that is briefly. The scriptures, formerly known as the Tanakh, came out of the circumcised Israelite community, which was the community that required for you to come into the understanding or into covenant of promise and come into the knowledge of the covenant and how it was taught from Moses. You had to be physically circumcised if you're a man, and you also had to pass through the rest of the rituals as a woman, right? Which was not physical circumcision, but you would have begun with ceremonial washing. This in particular meant that only the circumcised Israelites could interpret the scriptures, because their ceremonial circumcision, starting with the circumcision, the ceremonial circumcision literally meant cutting off of the animal skin that God put on man in the garden, and the animal skin in the garden represented the change of perspective, which was no longer self-existent and self-determining based on the nature of his own spirit, but mental codependency, which was comparing himself to external creation and using the external creation as a priority of his life and of his logic, of his identity, of his rationalization, of his system of judgment, and so on. So when that began, the Genesis chapter 3 says that God placed animal skin on them to indicate that they were no longer functioning from Yahweh. They were functioning like the serpent, which is like an animal, which is a helper, receiving thoughts instead of generating thoughts from their own nature. Only in the circumcised Israelite community was circumcision done in representation of the cutting off of the animal skin, which meant the abandonment of the helper way of thinking, which was the abandonment of using external things as your point of reference, or as your Elohim, right? As your source of wisdom. And then you would ceremonially wash, which means you enter into what you would call a mikvah. You can take a look at that online as M-I-K-V-V-E-H or A-H, mikvah. You'll enter into the mikvah, into running water, which is referred to as living waters, and you'll be submerged, and then you arise out of the water. And what that represented to them was being born. And since you were being born into the covenant, you were being born coming out of the womb, or the waters of the womb, you'd actually take on a different name, and that name was Yahweh, which is why you notice in the scriptures would say, if my people who are called by my name, right? God said that he surnamed them with his name as well. So they would rise and they take on the name Yahweh. And from the name Yahweh, then they would learn how to think through that name as a law of logic and memorize. That came with the memorization, which was the next step, memorization of the Tanakh, or memorization of the Torah to begin with, which was called the principle, the Torah of Yahweh, which meant the principle of Yahweh, or the principle of the self-existent, and the eternal. Yeah? So this was a covenant that you came into voluntarily. You take on Yahweh's name, and then you memorize Yahweh's words, or what Yahweh says. So they literally memorized the Torah from Genesis to Deuteronomy, and then they would then go on to further studies to memorize the prophets and even the sacred writings. Yeah. So I'm explaining all of this so that you get a very, very clear understanding as to why the Western world is incompetent to be able to interpret the scriptures, because they did not make the same decision, which was to abandon the helper way of thinking. They did not. There was no circumcision with the meaning of abandoning the external reference points of value, of self-value and self-addition, and embracing the title Yahweh and memorizing the scriptures as the thoughts that were birthed from the mindset or the logic of Yahweh, right, which would be self-existent and eternal thoughts that come from the nature of the Garden of Eden as one's original nature, right? That is a life-giving spirit. So when the scriptures fell into the hands of Westerners, which would be the Greco-Roman society, Greco-Roman civilization, it was passed into law that Christianity, not Jesus's understanding of the name that he discipled in, or the apostles' understanding of the name, but Emperor Constantine and Greeks and Greco-Roman persons opened the text and began to interpret it based on what the garden would mean, or how the garden would be understood through Greco-Roman minds. Right? That means that they had no knowledge of the name, no knowledge of the garden as it was taught, and they were not using, therefore, parodies as the method of interpretation of the scriptures. They just read it at face value, and therefore we have been taught that God created it in 7 days, and all of these things because of that perspective, that approach to the literature. So I trust that actually gives some context as to where we're going. And each episode, as I mentioned, I cannot guarantee that we cover a story per episode, but definitely what we can do is take a look at, in each episode, we further unpack. After we identify the simplicity of the Constantinian perspective that you may have been taught, when we step into the name and the God interpretation of the scriptures, then we may take a couple episodes or a few to unpack valuable insights that you need to know, that is actually not going to help your understanding of the scriptures, but help you to apply the scriptures in a more practical manner to your personal lives. Yeah? So, having established our formal introduction, let's now take a look at the first story in the scriptures. And the first story in the scriptures would be the God narrative, chapters 1 and 2 of the God of the Bible. Now, the first thing that I mentioned that the Bible was actually originally referred to as the Tanakh, and this is actually not specific to the New Testament. The Tanakh is an acronym that referred to what we call the Old Testament. Now, before these scriptures in particular got into the hands of Westerners, if you have not been taught this before, it's imperative that you take into consideration that the order of the scriptures that you have in the Old Testament is not the original order of the Bible. It's specific to the Old Testament. The Old Testament is still referred to in the Jewish community today as the Tanakh. Tanakh is an acronym that includes the word A, or the vowel A between the T and the A, the T and the N, and the N and the K, so that it can be pronounced as a word. But The acronym is actually TN and K. T stands for Torah, which is in reference to the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis to Deuteronomy, which is still maintained in its respective order, the original sequence. The second is Nevi'im, that means prophets. Right? Today, you have the Tanakh, and then you step into what you may refer to as history texts, and then wisdom literature, and then major and minor prophets. The scriptures was not ordered like that before it got into the hands of the Western world. It was actually categorized the first 5 books, and then they were prophets, all prophets. And then the last section was what's referred to as Ketuvim, which is actually the word that means sacred writings, which include wisdom literature. All right? It's sufficient to say is that your Bible begins today with Genesis and stops with the minor prophet Malachi, which is also pronounced Malachi. But in the original order of the text, the Bible actually started with Genesis and it ended with Chronicles. All right? Samuel, Kings, Chronicles were not first and second in the original text. They were just simply called Kings, Chronicles, Samuel. Right? So it actually ended, the Old Testament ends in its original order. It ends with Chronicles, which is why when you're reading Chronicles, it seems as though it's speaking about Adam, and then it's coming back and just passing over stories, coming back down to the present time at that time. And that's because Chronicles is designed to be a summary of the scriptures. Right? You can Google this. You can investigate the Tanakh online. You can access it. There are apps that you can that you can download as well, and you will see for yourself that the original order of the scriptures is from Genesis to Chronicles. It is only in the Western Christian world that this is unknown. Now, this is point number 1. Remember, we said we're going to cover 5 things that you should know. Point number 2. It is also unknown that in some versions of the Tanakh that can be found today, Genesis chapter 1 verse 1 that reads, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," is actually not recognized in some versions of the Tanakh. It's not recognized as an actual verse in the text. It is actually acknowledged as the title of the text, and the text then begins at verse 2, which means the title of the chapter would be, "In the beginning God created heaven and the earth," and then verse 2 in some versions of the Tanakh starts as verse 1 of the Bible. And the earth was without form and void, and that was upon the face of the deep. If you've heard that for the first time, please feel free to leave a comment and let me know how that piece of information impacts your mind. But it's also something that is unknown in Western culture. And obviously, because if we take a look around, we see that there is much confusion when it comes to looking at the Bible, even in the realms of theology within the Western Christian culture. So that ought to shake your theology a little bit. Yeah? Now, remember, when we are approaching the scriptures, whereas in the English-speaking world, in the Western Christian world, we read the text at face value, which simply means that we read the text, and whatever it says in its simplicity, we take it in its simplicity, and we say, okay, the text says this. This is exactly what the text says as we read it. Point number 3 here is that the God narrative is also approached through the Pardes method of interpretation, which is there are 4 levels of interpretation. So it does start in the beginning, in the simple meaning of the word "in the beginning," which could mean simplicity, a reference to some point of time. But this is not the full interpretation of the text. Your next step would be the concept behind the beginning. And that is actually interpreted to mean, or it's linked to King Solomon, as a matter of fact. King Solomon is one of the persons in the text, in the Bible, that actually makes reference to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 in Proverbs chapter 4. In Proverbs chapter 4, I'm going to read it for you. You'll notice that in the beginning, which is the Hebrew word badashit, let's put it up here. The Hebrew word badashit is actually seen as in the beginning. And King Solomon in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 7, he makes reference, the translators translate his use of the word badashit in chapter 4, verse 7 of Proverbs as the principal thing. As the principal thing. Right? Which means whilst Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 translates badashit as in the beginning, chapter 4, verse 7 translates the same badashit as the principal thing. Right? Which basically means if we interchange that with Genesis chapter 1, it would read, in the principal thing, God created the heavens and the earth. Yeah? But there's something in particular in chapter 4, verse 7 that King Solomon indicates, that which is actually the concept that we're making reference to. He hints to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, and he says that wisdom is badashit, which means Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 can be read in wisdom. God created the heaven and the earth. In wisdom, right? In wisdom as the principal thing, God created the heaven and the earth. Right? That's point number 3. If you're hearing that for the first time, again, please leave a comment in the comment section. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these simple points that it's very good that you understand when you're approaching the text. Point number 4. The word Elohim, it's actually in the Hebrew text, the word Elohim, which is the word that is translated God, does not mean the same thing as God in the Greco-Roman Christian world. When we say God, we have actually used and adopted a very Greek version of God, which is someone who is up in the heavens and he is all-powerful and infinite. And this is a concept that was birthed in Rome, in the Roman society. Right? As a matter of fact, the title God refers to, or not necessarily the title, the context of God that we hold in Western culture. If you do some research, you'd realize that the concept of God as a life-giving God that gives life to everything and is infinite and all-powerful, even though that may have truth to it in the text, that concept of this God that is infinite, that is not found in the text, by the way, was given birth in Rome, from a Roman god in particular, which I'm not going to get into here in this episode, but it was attributed to a particular Roman god, and when Christianity was born, they incorporated that perspective of that Roman god as God, as the Father of Jesus Christ, which is not from your Bible. Right? The title God, which is that, basically what I'm saying is that the context of God in the Western culture, it's very Gentile. In the context of the scriptures, the word God is a translation of the Hebrew word Elohim, which, number 1, is a plural noun. The singular noun to that is Eloah. Elohim is plural. And 2, Elohim refers to authority and power. It also refers to when someone or something is called Elohim, your Elohim, it is in reference to the thing that you use as your strength, the thing that you use as your source of mindset, the thing that you use as your authority, the thing that you use as your source of validation, your source of self-approval, your source of self-esteem. Right? If you're hearing this for the first time, please leave your thoughts in the comment section. We'd very much like to hear how this understanding resonates with you. And it is also in reference to Elohim as the authority, meaning the person from which all other creation receives thought and life and energy, power, which means the person that is called Elohim is not a receiver of life or receiver of thoughts. The thing that is called Elohim is the giver of the thought, the giver of life, and the giver of power. All right? It has nothing to do with being infinite, as in unattainable. The word Elohim, on the other hand, is also a plural noun that is attributed to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It may be useful for you to know that in the ancient Israelite perspective of Elohim, the language is structured in a way that when a plural noun is attributed to a singular entity, the plurality that it infers changes from a quantitative context, meaning more than one, to a qualitative context, which is plurality as in more than one quality. One entity with more than one quality and no longer one entity, and no longer more than one entity as in plural numbers. That means that when Elohim is mentioned in the very first verse of the Bible that you're carrying today, in the beginning, Elohim created the heaven and the earth. This is in reference to Elohim, meaning a multifaceted or qualitatively plural entity, an entity that has many qualities, created heaven and earth. And you may be surprised to know that this person then goes on to express in Genesis chapter 1 his thoughts and establishes this plan that is actual creation in the spiritual realm, actual creation that has a historical date in the spiritual realm, and a location in the spiritual realm. This person creates and reveals his different qualities in various creation. So what you see is the qualitatively plural entity creates an entire garden that is a multiplication of himself in the spiritual realm, revealing the various qualities that he possesses as various creation. So what we see is an entity that is qualitative, has a multiplicity of qualities, creates, and all of his qualities reveals itself as many creation, such as trees and animals and all of these different things, and different types of animals, different types of trees, and wind and water and mountains and sky. And what you're looking at there is an entity, Elohim, God, that is multifaceted, creates this garden in chapter 1 in the spiritual realm before he breathes it into man, which is what we'll speak about that later on. But in chapter 1 alone, you see that there is a multiplication of creation that comes from him. Right? He's multiplying after his own kind. That's point number 4. Yeah, again, if you're hearing that for the first time, let us know in the comments. Point number 5. Do you know that heaven and earth is a reference to man as in his breath or his spirit is called heavens, and the earth is in reference to the physical body. And by the law of multiplication after his own kind, the man, heaven and earth, then reproduces heaven and earth in the same multiplicity of quality, revealing itself in multiplicity of quantity. So heaven and earth man then reproduces what we call heaven and earth, as in the sky and the land and all of the animals in it. Right? So man, heaven and earth, and all of its various qualities, which is a multiplication of God, because God created. There are some texts that actually says that God created. There's some texts, like in some Spanish versions of the Bible, which has a different lineage of translation. They don't use the word created. They use the word give birth to. Right? God gave birth to heaven and earth. Again, unknown in Western culture, especially in the English-speaking Western culture. They do not know that some Spanish versions of the Bible says, instead of God created heaven and earth, it says God gave birth to heaven and earth, in reference to giving birth to his son. And his son, heaven and earth, then reproduced heaven and earth. His spirit is multiplied after its kind. This is why in the New Testament you see that Christ is called heaven and earth, and then when he breathes the breath of life onto the disciples, he then ascends and fills all things also, because it is an allusion to him being in man, like God created man and giving birth to the species, and then the species giving birth to the cosmos, which is heaven and earth. All right. And I'll give you one more as a bonus point. So this is point number 6, bonus point. Do you know that the word Elohim in the Bible, we just mentioned, means the one that is giving thought? It is the use of the word Elohim in the text, because it is actually in Genesis chapter 1, it's specific to the spiritual realm. And everything comes from God, is a multiplication of him. The word Elohim in the text is not meant to be his name per se, but his function. Right? His name, the name is then given in chapter 2, which is what we will come to that later on. And in chapter 1, the word Elohim is designed to be an identifier of a function. There is no name simply because in the absence of physical creation, there's nothing to compare God to. And where there's no comparison, God simply is. He simply exists. Identification is only necessary in the presence of comparison. Right? In chapter 1, Elohim is used as an identifier of function, meaning that this person is the only person that gives thought to all of these things that are being created. He does not receive thought from it. And the creation receives thought. They do not give him thought or give themselves thought or give themselves life. He is the one that gives them life, gives them power, and gives all of the things created thoughts. He is the source of the thoughts in all creation. He is not a receiver of thoughts. Right? So that's your bonus point. And this brings us to the end of our debut episode of Reboot Biblical Perspective educational podcast. This is episode 1, where, in summary, what we did was give you a brief summary as to what this season is going to be about, what to expect, and we gave you 5 points with a bonus point, which is now 6. 5 things that you should know about just Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, before we even begin to speak about the God narrative. Right? This is going to be a weekly episode, so this is actually going to be posted on Patreon, and we encourage conversation. The first episode will be free for all members of Patreon. This first episode will be free for all members of Patreon. The upcoming episodes will be limited to Spiritual Gold members alone. I am your host, Zin El Fuego, on the mic. This is Rebutive Biblical Perspective, and see you on the next episode. Boom. Yeshua.